So after 10 years of waiting, I finally had a chance to play Dragon Age the Veilguard several times, and my feelings are complicated. I actually thought about making multiple videos about this because I want to be fair. I want to give the game credit where it's due, where it succeeds on its own merits. But I also think it's missing some of the core of what I look for in a Dragon Age game. So in this video, I'm going to try to be fair while also being honest about my disappointments. For starters, some unabashed positives. The gameplay of Veilguard is genuinely quite fun. The combat system is engaging and has some depth, though I would have liked more options for my mage, and I don't like being limited to 2 companions. I was pretty happy with that side of the game, though I admit I've never really been particularly drawn to these games for the combat gameplay one way or the other. I also had fun exploring the levels, though the rewards for doing so were a bit underwhelming. I also felt that some levels strayed into feeling more like video game levels than real places, the worst offender being Treviso, though I blame the zip lines for that. The game also launched in a great technical state. In a gaming landscape where so many big games have launched with unstable, buggy, and unoptimized builds on release, that's genuinely something I think the team deserves a lot of praise for. They also put in a lot of quality of life and accessibility features that were very nice. And even many critical responses to the game have praised the ending missions of Act 3, which I still think is probably the best climax BioWare has ever managed in their games. It elevated my whole score for the Veilguard. In general, I would say the central narrative of Veilguard is very competently executed with very dramatic moments. On the art style, I'm actually quite happy with the environmental art. Minrathous and Treviso in particular both look very good. I'm quite happy with them on that front. They are as magical and decadent as I'd hoped they would be. As to the slightly exaggerated art style of the characters themselves, I thought it was fine, though they did mess up a bit with the Qunari player character, I think largely because they made the gap between horns, hairline, and brow too big. You can make decent Qunari characters in this character creator, but you basically need to take every option possible to make that forehead area as small as possible. I should say the hair technology was also very cool, and I like seeing my character with flowing locks. What I did have a big problem with was the armor designs. Frankly, I thought about 80% of them were way too ornate, and with some questionable color choices at times. The Lords of Fortune outfits were probably the worst, where I had to choose between really gaudy over-the-top armor or going into battle half-naked. I also disliked the Crow's outfits, especially, though I actually think the problem has more to do with the color. I'm not good with colors, but it's sort of a muted purple. I don't like the way it looks and the way it's the dominant color in just about every Crow armor. If the dominant color for the Assassin's Guild had been, say, black, I think I would have liked these designs a lot more. It makes sense for some of the ancient elven-inspired designs to be ornate, but I shied away from those for the same reason. As for the game's music, I definitely found this to be the most underwhelming soundtrack of the franchise. A lot of the tracks make use of these synths that feel very out of place in Dragon Age, though once you get past those, there are a few tracks that I genuinely liked. But none of them are going to be ranked alongside Trevor Morris's work in Inquisition or Inon Zur's best tracks from the first 2 games in my book. If this is what shelling out money for Hans Zimmer gets you, then I definitely don't think BioWare got its money's worth. Just my 2 cents, if BioWare gets to make another Dragon Age, maybe try Evan Call. I'm saying this mostly because I've been listening to his soundtrack for Freerin Beyond Journey's End as I wrote the script for this video, and I think it's quite good. I think he could turn out a banger of a Dragon Age soundtrack given the chance, and he's probably a lot cheaper than Hans Zimmer. Now on to my biggest area of critique, the writing and story. Taken in broad terms, I think there are some narrative problems with the main story of the Veilguard. For one, there's a part of Act 2 where it gets a bit directionless. You feel like you're just waiting for things to happen and getting bombarded with companion content, a lot of which is just going to places to have conversations. The bigger problem, though, is a general lack of big choices for most of the game. We have the choice to save Minrathous or Treviso, but that's less impactful than I would have liked. Also, in my first playthrough, I was not playing as a Shadow Dragon or Antivan Crow, so I had no particular attachment to either city, and I honestly didn't feel like I had a particularly good reason to pick one over the other. I chose to save Minrathous, which I felt was misleadingly presented because it was pitched as stopping the Venatori from pulling a political coup. Later in the Shadow Dragon subplot, we learn that the Venatori succeeded in assassinating the Archon anyway, so it felt a bit pointless. That's the only really big choice we get until Act 3. Overall, the plot has some great set pieces and moments, but weak opportunities for choices. Reactivity to Rook's lineage and background is also a mixed bag. It seems pretty strong for Grey Wardens and the Morn Watch, but the Lords of Fortune are at the bottom of the barrel in terms of reactivity. I don't think being a mage gave my character many unique options beyond a few comments, and I don't think my character's race came up more than a handful of times. I also really don't like the way we're introduced to Rook in the introduction of the game. More precisely, I don't like that we're thrown straight into the action with no real understanding of our pre-existing relationships and rapport with Varric and Harding. BioWare has done in medias res openings for every one of their games since Mass Effect 2, and I think it can work, but there's something to be said for easing the player into the things our character is supposed to know. Dropping us into the climax of the hunt for Solus without more than a superficial understanding of why we're working with Varric was not the right move. Playing through that recruitment story would help, or even something before we start playing. I've always wished more games took inspiration from the game Tyranny in this regard, which had a very fun pre-game background idea that basically had you make a series of choices for your character's career prior to the start of the game, which would influence how some factions see you and the state of some areas. It's all done mostly with some art and text, so it wouldn't be as resource-intensive as making playable origins, but it would add a lot, I think. What if we could go through the story of us working with Varric to find Solus in this way? I think that would go a long way to helping me feel like my Rook has actually been working with Varric and has a connection to him and Harding that I can understand from the beginning. Speaking of Rook, let's move on to discussing character writing in general. I played through the game several times, but twice used the same Rook voice. In the first playthrough, I tried to be a positive, somewhat jokey version of the character. In the second, I tried to be as serious as possible. My experience is that even when trying to be serious or guarded, Rook always boomerangs back to a very positive or jokey character after a line or two. Even some of the serious lines had my Rook cracking jokes. Rook is also very much pushed to be a heroic character who tries to do the right thing regardless. This comes out in interactions with the companions, where Rook is often but not always railroaded into being supportive of them. I'm not sure it's possible to have a companion actually dislike you if you interact with them regularly. Despite having a wide variety of backgrounds and lineages that can create fun moments when interacting with certain groups and companions, these moments tend to be brief, and Rook ultimately probably has the least range of personality of any BioWare protagonist. I've talked to people that were very upset when I said this about Rook because they love the sort of hero Rook is written as, and that's fine, but understand that the problem is that Rook is limited to only that type of heroic character. Apparently this used to be a lot worse. Someone that was part of the community council BioWare consulted with said that the version of Rook they saw about 2 or 3 years before release was just a non-stop stream of jokes and quips for every dialogue option. Star-Lord without the charm is how they put it. This is the toned-down version. There's a general tendency to push for a very upbeat and optimistic tone in the dialogue, in a way that was often pretty blunt and with companions can stray to being downright saccharine. In many conversations, I felt like my Rook was giving out lines from a self-help book or a therapist, rather than interacting the way a normal person or friend would. I know being our companion's therapist is a bit of a meme for BioWare games in general, but it usually isn't this blunt. I'm left asking if Rook is their friend or their life coach, especially when Rook starts giving a corny speech about teamwork that feels less like an epic battle speech and more like something I'd hear at a corporate team-building exercise. That could just be me being older and more jaded than when I played the older games, admittedly. This feeling is especially prominent when Rook intervenes in what are often extremely petty and low-stakes arguments between companions, and speaks to them like a teacher correcting children. That contributes to a general sense of distance between Rook and the companions. That Rook is set apart from everyone during the group discussion scenes also doesn't help with this. I actually feel less connected to these companions than previous Dragon Age casts. It's funny because otherwise this game actually takes pains to develop the relationships between the companions, which makes Rook feel even more apart by comparison. I'd come across them bantering in the lighthouse, and once the banter plays, they just fall silent and don't acknowledge Rook. I know this wasn't intended, but I feel like a manager whose employees fall silent when they enter a room. This game badly needs a card-playing scene like the Inquisitor had with their inner circle, something to really make Rook feel integrated into the group. Keep in mind, I am speaking in generalities. There are individual conversations and scenes that are pretty good and work, but I found them to be the exception rather than the rule. One of the things they did to try and flesh out relationships in the party was have certain companions form romantic relationships if neither of them is being romanced by Rook. It's a neat idea. The flaw in this design is that these characters keep flirting until you lock in the romance during Act 2, which I know made certain players I've heard from trying to romance Nev or Lucanus in particular rather uncomfortable. Apparently, they were left with the impression that both companions were more interested and responsive to each other rather than Rook's flirting. The vibes were awkward. There's a point where Rook can openly describe their group as a family, which, first of all, I don't feel was earned, but also speaks to how the writing bluntly states things that should be left to subtext. In my opinion, the found family trope becomes extremely cringy when characters who haven't really known each other that long start openly describing one another as family. It feels forced. On the companions, I have a few general complaints. There's a lack of nuance or subtext in most conversations, with a lot of repetitious expository dialogue, especially in Act 1. There's only a limited clash of personality or ideas except a few brief, low-stakes, and quickly resolved situations. I've heard people say it makes sense that the companions all get along given they understand the stakes, but people that don't get along being forced to work together is where a lot of fun character interactions spring from in these stories. Conflict creates tensions that accentuate the strong personalities and complicated relationships of the characters. They can also form microcosms of the broader tensions in the setting, like Fenris and Anders absolutely despising each other over their views on mages. Almost everyone being agreeable and well-adjusted, well, it's a bit boring to be honest. It's too easy and everyone just seems a bit more bland. And yes, I know there are a handful of conversations with some bite to them, but these are brief exceptions that are easily lost in the overwhelming majority of conversations that lack such personality conflicts. Some of the companions feel underwritten to me. For Lucanus and Nev in particular, I kept waiting for conversations where they would open up and talk about their history and backgrounds, but that never really happens. Lucanus is the worst of the two, especially since a whole chunk of his story can be missed if you don't save Treviso. His development just abruptly stops and he'll tell you he's going to deal with spite in his own way eventually. He's an abomination, mage-killing assassin, and it's really shocking how little of those things are actually developed into interesting plots. Some of it is, but it feels like there's a lot more potential than the writing around him actually took advantage of. He definitely has the most missed potential of the characters. Some of the personal details I was looking for are in the game, but in easily missed companion banters that Rook isn't a part of. I had Nev pegged almost immediately as a private eye with a heart of gold, someone that wants to help but has been dragged down into cynicism by their experiences. It's a very standard noir detective archetype in some ways, and that's fine, but I kept waiting for something more personal to emerge, a human element or connection to latch onto as part of her story. But it never really happened. I never really felt like she opened up in a big way. I just learned that she's sad about how hard the world is. I figured that out the moment I recognized her archetype, so I really needed more than that. Her companion quest in particular felt oddly impersonal, like really this is just another case for her at the end of the day. I get that the villain is supposed to be mocking her by targeting people she ostensibly cares about, though none seem much more than contacts and acquaintances, and challenging her ability to safeguard Docktown. But I never really felt like there was any personal connection for her to the villain, or why this case should be much more important to her than any other bad case she's had. That these sort of deeper character-exploring conversations feel missing for some characters makes it really jarring that there are so many fully animated, purely fluff conversations to be had with them. On their own, these aren't a problem. They can be cute or fun, but they are very superficial interactions at the end of the day, and it's hard not to wonder why I'm getting this and not more meaningful interactions. Some of this might have been alleviated if we could talk to our companions at any time and ask some of these basic questions about themselves. I'll offer some brief thoughts on the writing of the other characters. I liked Harding, but I think her writing is harmed by the fact that she's being used for a couple different things. She's been given a plot line that could have been slapped onto any dwarven character and doesn't have much to do with Lace personally, and in group conversations she's often being pigeonholed into acting as a spokeswoman for the Reformed Solus position, or occasionally chiming in to offer the Andrastian or dwarven perspective. That last one itself is weird, since Lace doesn't really have much connection to her dwarven heritage as she grew up in a human farming community in Ferelden. As a result, a lot of the interactions with her don't feel like Lace Harding as a character is being given a chance to shine. This is alleviated somewhat in her romance. One criticism I actually don't agree with is that she's too different from what she was like in Inquisition, too immature and lacking confidence. Remember, in that game, Lace was in her element, scouting and reporting in the wilderness, and we were interacting with her not only as her boss, but also a major figure of her religion. It makes sense that she would be projecting a more serious and confident attitude. In the Veilguard, we're speaking much more as equals, and she's going through some rough changes, so I think the difference makes a lot of sense. I actually came into this game expecting to dislike Balara, but she quickly showed some nice emotional depth that made the quirky, eccentric engineer girl qualities much easier to take. She's also heavily coded as someone struggling with ADHD, which I also have, so I liked that. She has a very personal story that I was able to feel invested in, which makes me like her more than Lucanus and Nev, but she isn't isolated from the general dialogue problems in the game I've talked about. Davrin is a bit hard to talk about because I have to separate my feelings about his writing from the dopamine hit I get anytime I see Asan on screen. It's hard, they did a good job making him cute. On the whole, I think Davrin is one of the better explored characters, and I enjoyed the story of his struggle to take care of Asan. He also has one of the better companion quests, though the character of Davrin himself sometimes feel a bit lost in Asan's shadow. I feel more could have been done with him rather than making it all about Asan. His story and background are also somewhat at odds. He talks like someone that doesn't know what he's doing as far as raising animals when it comes to Asan, but when we learn more about his youth among the Dalish, we find that he actually has apparently always had a great affinity for animals like the Hala. Maybe those two things aren't in conflict, but it seems odd. Then there's Emmerich, my breakout favorite companion in this game. I genuinely found him very charming. Whether you like the morbidly whimsical approach to necromancy is going to be very subjective, but I did. His journey is one of the only ones that has an interesting choice at the end of it, and I very much felt like I was playing a Dragon Age game while thinking about it. It's a case where I think either choice makes a lot of sense for the character. Very few of his interactions have the superficial quality I was talking about earlier. I feel like I'm learning about not just Emmerich, but the entire Mortalitasi approach to spirits when I talk with him, even if we aren't advancing his plot. He's clearly been very thoughtfully written as a mature, older man that still finds the world remarkable, and wants to nurture those who need his help, namely Manfred. It's fun to fall into a mentor-mentee relationship with him when playing as a Mournwatch. I feel like I'm talking to a real Dragon Age companion when I'm talking to Emmerich more so than anyone in the rest of the cast. That's probably why my Mournwatch Rook will be my canon for this game. Now, before I talk about Tash, I want to talk about another writing issue, the use of modern language and ways of speaking. This isn't a constant problem, and indeed some modern dialogue has always been present in these games, but every once in a while a character in Veilguard will use a modern bit of slang or speech structure that feels out of place and odd, more often than in previous games. Former Dragon Age lead writer David Gator has spoken about how they had a rule when writing Dragon Age Origins to avoid using words and idioms that came into common use after the year 1900. They did relax this rule on occasion, notably for Alistair and for the sake of comedy more generally, but overall they held to it to maintain the feel of this world as distinctive from our own and the medieval fantasy aesthetic. I think they should consider reinstating this rule for any future Dragon Age games. It makes the setting feel more mundane if this sort of modern language becomes too common. There's also less Dragon Age specific idioms in this game. I don't actually recall anyone saying Maker's Breath or Andraste's whatever in this game either, nor any of the Dalish or Tevinter specific swears we've heard in previous games unless I missed something. Oddly, Morrigan and Solus in particular still talk with the sort of language they did in previous games, which is probably at least part of the reason interactions with them felt closer to the Dragon Age I wanted. Even Dorian still uses the older syntax compared to other characters, so it's not like the writers can't do it. The problem of overly modern language is most evident in Tash, who uses more modern ways of speaking than any other character. And yes, this ties into the discussion of their storyline coming to discover their non-binary identity. I almost deleted this section several times because I don't want people to take it out of context or think I'm a culture war grifter or some such, which is not my intention. I'm not going to critique that storyline substantively. In general, I think it was a good story to try to tell, but I will comment on how the issue is handled from a world-building perspective, since that is what I tend to talk about on this channel. Ultimately, these issues of gender are cultural issues. Gender and all the expectations we attach to it are culturally defined, and thus any storyline touching on those things in a fantasy world needs to be grounded in the cultures of that world in order to feel like an organic part of it. We've had characters and plotlines comment on issues of gender roles and similar issues in Dragon Age before, mostly in terms of characters running against expectations put on them by their culture and society. Tash's story is about halfway there in terms of juxtaposing their mother's Kunari understanding of gender, but on the other side of it, it's very lacking. That's part of why just dropping the term non-binary out of nowhere feels very odd, and the way Tash discovers it is honestly kind of painful to me. There's a codex of Tash's notes where it seems like someone just copied a bunch of gender and sexuality identifications off a Wikipedia article, and we're just told, oh, Maeveris and Tarkin mentioned these. There's no effort to ground these identities in terms of what they mean and what are the attitudes towards them in this world. These terms, in addition to just sounding very modern, feel abruptly plopped down without context, and as a result, they feel jarringly out of place. You could still use these terms if you feel that's important, but you have to do the groundwork of integrating the concepts behind them into the world instead of haphazardly dropping them in like this. Frankly, I thought this was a huge missed opportunity to expand on Rivaini culture as well. Maybe there's a concept of non-binary or third gender in Rivaini culture that Tash might identify with. That would have tied their identity struggle to their struggles as a child of two cultures, and also gives us a nice window to help distinguish Rivaini society from the rest of Thedas. Rivain remains very underexplored, much to my annoyance. Additionally, it is weird that Tevinter would be the mecca for these ideas, since we know from Krem and Mayveris experiences that it is very much not an accepting society for such things. I hope none of that came off the wrong way. To step away from that topic and look at the rest of Tash's character, on the other side, her story is actually a pretty well-done second-generation immigrant story. Tash is the child caught between the culture they grew up in and the culture of an ancestral home pushed on them by their mother. My only complaint is the choice at the end, which frames a binary forcing Tash to choose between them. I don't think that's how it really works. As for how I felt interacting with Tash as a character, I did not like them very much. Tash is written with a very immature, often crass, and sometimes inconsiderate attitude. A lot of people would describe Sarah from Inquisition like that, and it's probably why she's the only companion in that game the player can jettison from the party at any time. What's funny is that I went into this game with an idea that it might be fun to romance the rough-and-tumble Kunari warrior, but within minutes of meeting Tash, I was struck with a strong impression of a sulky teenager, and all my romantic interest instantly evaporated. I just could not view this character as an adult from that point on. I started thinking of my Rook more as Tash's chaperone than an equal friend while on their companion missions. I don't think Tash is a bad character, I just found interacting with them a bit grating. On the other side of that, I actually appreciate that Tash is perhaps the only companion that drives any interpersonal conflict in the group due to how blunt she is. On the subject of the antagonists, there are hints of potentially interesting characterizations of Elgar'nan and Gillinane, mostly in Codex entries, but for the most part they come across as powerful but very blandly evil villains. They feel written as obstacles first and characters second. It bugs me to say this, but I thought Corypheus had more depth in Inquisition, and he was perhaps my least favorite Dragon Age antagonist before this. His existential anguish and feelings of betrayal by his gods at least created something behind his megalomaniacal tendencies. Solus is largely handled fairly well, and the conversations with him are a highlight, but I think something important is missing from his story. For all the focus on his background and the idea that he's motivated by regret, the impact of the Veil on the elves of modern Thedas is largely unmentioned. We get a brief mention of Solus freeing slaves, but otherwise the plight of the elves in modern Thedas is unexplored. There's no look at the elven slaves in Tevinter, nor elves as an oppressed minority in the rest of Thedas. Even the outcast status of the Dalish elves isn't really addressed. One would think this was a big part of his regrets, but all he ever mentions is being annoyed that the Dalish worship a mythologized version of the Evanuris. Unfortunately, most of the minor villains aren't much better than Elgar'nan and Gillinane. They range from near comically evil blood mages to comically obvious traitors that I think everyone playing the game is going to figure out immediately. The only antagonist I found genuinely interesting was the Butcher, one of the Antom warlords. It's actually quite impressive. In the span of a single conversation where he discusses his view of the city of Treviso, he comes across as a very thoughtfully written character with an interesting perspective. He died immediately after this, sadly. So let's move on from the characters and talk about some broader issues with the factions and subplots. One of the game's greatest failures, and probably my greatest source of frustration, is the general failure to take advantage of the setting. We're visiting storied locations like Minrathous and Antiva, yet the stories we're being told barely touch on the unique elements of these settings. Minrathous is the ancient capital of the oldest empire in Thedas, a place with its own colosseum, ancient elite magic schools built out of repurposed old god temples, a dwarven settlement under the city, and yet the only part of this city I really get to see is a single slum. I want you to take a moment to consider how frustrating this was for me, someone that has adored Dragon Age world building and lore from the beginning. That alone might not have soured me completely, except that virtually none of the subplots that take place in Docktown have any meaningful engagement with any uniquely Tevinter plot elements. There's nothing about the politics of the Magisterium. We don't get to free any slaves, save for exactly one that I think is restricted to Shadow Dragon Brooks because I never saw it, and we don't get any real exploration of the Imperial Chantry or the class struggle of the Soparati with mages. There are a few moments of acknowledgement of these things at times, but only in very minor ways, or in the case of slavery, it's mostly just when the Venatori are doing it. These aren't things the game ever actually tells a story about. I actually think most of these quests could take place in virtually any slum in Thedas with a vaguely oppressive aristocracy with minimal changes. Tevinter feels like it's mostly window dressing as far as the plots are concerned. Treviso has similar problems. There are no merchant princes, no Antivan politics. Everything Antivan about Antiva we could have a plot about is supplanted by fighting the invading Antom. At least there's a plot reason for that, somewhat, but it feels like a grand waste of Antiva as a setting. The bigger problem with Antiva, though, is how they chose to write the Antivan Crows. Now, I don't think there's an inherent problem with the idea that there's a faction of the Antivan Crows that want to take the organization in a more moral direction, to an extent, and that's what the developers have said this is, but it's part of a larger trend in this game where absolutely everyone we consort with is unambiguously good. There is no moral grayness or ambiguity to any faction we work with, excepting the Grey Wardens, and I'll come back to that in a moment. This is a change from the way previous games approach things, and it makes the world feel sanitized or simplified in a way. Rook is the unambiguous hero, working with his unambiguously heroic and pure allies to save the day from the very unambiguously evil villains. Solus is really the only arguable exception to this, which is why interactions with him are such a highlight most of the time. This isn't limited to the factions. We also have a character tell us that the horrific treatment of mages under the Qun was actually just an Antom thing, and the rest of the Qun doesn't treat them any worse than anywhere else in Thedas. Granted, the character saying this was not a Qunari living under the Qun herself, so she could be wrong, but it somewhat gives the impression of an effort to displace the negative aspects of the Qun onto the now rogue Antom. There doesn't seem to be much appetite for dealing with the darkness within Thedas' societies, as opposed to darkness from some crazy evil group like the Venatori, blood-hungry rogue Antom, and the Darkspawn. We don't get to see any slaves unless they're owned by the Venatori. We don't get to see any of the religious extremism of the Qun or the Imperial Chantry for that matter, because the former is represented only by rogue elements and the latter is absent. We don't get to involve ourselves with any of the workings of an amoral assassins guild, because all the ones we meet are patriotic freedom fighters. Even the pirate thieves are not actually pirates and emphasize how culturally sensitive they are in their thefts. There's not even a single instance of bigotry towards elves so much as mentioned in this game that I encountered. That's what I mean when I say things feel sanitized. It's not that darkness no longer exists. There's plenty of body horror and some disturbing moments, but it's very clearly demarcated along black and white lines with no room for ambiguities. Frankly, it just makes the world feel more shallow and one-dimensional compared to previous Dragon Age titles. For the record, because this apparently needs to be said for some people I've talked to, I am not asking for a positive portrayal of slavery, but I do want slavery to be presented as a wider, culturally ingrained social issue in Tevinter, with all the complex difficulties of instituting dramatic social change it entails, rather than being relegated to the background unless the evil blood cult is doing it. Class strife should be present throughout the storytelling in Tevinter, but it really isn't beyond the very general notion of Docktown as an oppressed slum not unlike many in Thedas. There's just no moral or political complexity in the way this game tells stories about this world. You won't have any debates from this game like those the fandom once had about Loghain or the Mage-Templar conflict. The only real exception to this is the Grey Wardens, who are portrayed as the ruthless organization that they are beneath their heroic veneer, though it's very much treated as a surprise for some reason, despite the fact that players have known this about them since the first game. Anyone who's read the novel Last Light will know about this exact issue, in fact. It's weird that the Grey Wardens are presented as the shady faction when the Assassins for Hire are being presented so positively. The first Warden was actually my favorite faction leader because he's the only one that has a rational reaction to the pretty crazy story Rook is peddling about ancient gods popping up. Everyone else is very quick not only to believe Rook, but also trust them with the fate of the world. I haven't said anything about the Veil Jumpers yet, and that's because they're fairly insubstantial. They seem to be intended as a Dalish faction, but they had to justify allowing non-elves to join for player background, so they made the Veil Jumpers. Nothing about them is really explored at all, not their origins beyond being very recently established, nor how they found out the truth about the elven gods. The game doesn't really do much with them beyond being guides whenever the plot calls for going into Arlathan Forest. They do raise many unanswered questions, like how are the Dalish responding to finding out their gods are real, but not gods and evil? Some of them really should be tempted to follow these gods they've worshipped all their lives. Balara makes a sad comment occasionally, and there are a few ambient statements in the Veil Jumper camp, but that's generally as far as that discussion goes. There's no exploration of it beyond a token acknowledgement. In general, I found the writing about religion in this game to be a major step down, which is surprising considering these same writers worked on Inquisition, which addressed writing about faith with more complexity. Sometimes I felt like the writing just didn't understand the weight religion has for many people, or what a huge deal it is, particularly in societies where it's deeply tied to cultural and personal identity in the way it is for the Dalish. There was a chance to address revelations about the Black City's implications for the Andrastian faith that I felt was a bit better addressed, but it doesn't really help the Elven issues. And for that matter, where is the army of Elven agents Solas had gathered for himself? I know the developers offered some explanation about Solas hating the idea of being a leader, but frankly that's hogwash and doesn't agree at all with what we saw of him in Trespasser or the flashbacks in Veilguard. None of these questions about what the events of this game meant for the elves are meaningfully addressed. I don't have any notes on the Mournwatch. They're fine, even if they don't really have much to do with anything. In a perfect world, I would have liked to see a little of Navarra City and engaged a bit with that part of the setting, but for a faction confined to the Grand Necropolis, I thought they were okay. As with Emmerich, the morbid whimsy of their portrayal is going to be a your mileage may vary situation. The only thing I have to say about the Lords of Fortune is that they are incredibly irrelevant to the rest of this plot. I actually had some high hopes for them. I was hoping they would be some old Rivaini institution, reflecting some Rivaini attitudes and culture. Instead, it's just a group of quirky treasure hunters Isabella founded just recently when she got tired of piracy. They have an arena, which isn't very interesting, and it sort of felt like rubbing salt in the wound for me that this game never takes us to the grand proving arena in Minrathous. If their respect for cultural artifacts had been framed as Isabella not wanting to be chased down by another army, I could accept that, but it's not. Instead, it feels like the developers are nudging me, saying, "Hey, isn't the British Museum terrible?" It felt stilted and unnatural. As for the Shadow Dragons, I just found them sort of bland, and I can't take the Viper very seriously, partly because of his outfit. There's a codex that implies he's actually the Black Divine, the head of the Imperial Chantry, which leaves me wondering how he has time to hang out in the clubhouse all day, and how that small bit of face covering is really enough to hide his identity. This feels like something that was part of a cut plot. Actually, the Shadow Dragon subplot, If You Save Minrathous, was the only time while playing this game that I actually felt irrationally angry. So we're suddenly told that the leader of the Imperial Templars is working with the Venatori, and they're planning to raise some Darkspawn to attack the city from below to take advantage of the Archon being assassinated, which we also just learned about. After a bland set of corridor fights, we kill him and uncover blackmail evidence so potent that it will allow our allies to seize control of the Magisterium and become Archon. We get to choose, Mayveris or Dorian, and whichever gets chosen will outlaw slavery. This is all extremely abrupt with almost no build-up, and in no way does this level of narrative consequence feel earned by the plot. I actually felt insulted while playing the game, because this felt like such weak justification. I really hated it. If you want to have that kind of consequence for the plot, it needs a lot more build-up. Granted, I think it implied getting rid of slavery wouldn't actually be that simple, but still, Mayveris and Dorian have no reason to be giving that sort of decision to Rook in the first place, and after spending so little time in this game exploring Tevinter as a society, it feels especially unearned. Now, next I want to talk about the way huge lore reveals are handled in this game, and before I do, I need to explain my own feelings about the deep lore. One of the things I appreciated about Dragon Age when I first picked up Origins was the ambiguity of the mythology. I liked that this was a world where people didn't know if their gods and myths were true. I thought the lack of clarity was a feature, not a bug. It allows for stories about faith, or lack thereof, of people that have to live with ambiguity. This is directly contrasted to traditional Dungeons & Dragons settings where gods are known interventionist quantities. I always sort of bounced off those settings, personally. I didn't mind hints about the deep lore, but I've never been much of a theory crafter despite making several dozen Dragon Age lore videos over the early years of this channel, because I never really wanted definitive answers to a lot of these questions. Most of my videos were about things like Ferelden history and legends the modern peoples of Thedas believe. The mysteriousness was something to be preserved for me, not a problem to be resolved. The Blight, for example, I thought was more interesting as a nigh Lovecraftian source of unknowable evil and corruption, rather than something to be fully explained. Now that I know what the Blight is, I kind of find it less interesting. I had misgivings when BioWare first started heading down this route with Corypheus suggesting the truth of the Golden City, and more when the truth of the Evanuris was revealed. I sort of hoped we would stop Solus in Dragon Age 4 and then back off the apocalyptic stories without revealing too much about the ancient world. I've never thought that the deep lore was where BioWare's plot focus should be, though it certainly makes for a compelling backdrop for the world. I've always hoped for more human-level stories. The apocalyptic threat is usually the least compelling part of these games for me. The best stories they had, in my opinion, were usually found when exploring the societies and peoples of modern Thedas, not digging up god monsters to fight from the ancient past. If I had my druthers, the Blight would have been left to fester in the background in Origins, and the rest of the series would have been about conflicts built upon the social, national, and religious tensions of Thedas. I know that's not necessarily a common view. I remember when Dragon Age 2 was released, and so many people complained that Dragon Age is just about Grey Wardens saving the world and fighting the Blight. A rags-to-riches immigrant story was apparently not what a lot of people wanted from Dragon Age. Even the developers always planned these world-shaking high-stakes plots to be the focus, I know. I just think they were misguided. Veilguard pushes the stakes into the stratosphere and rather bluntly rattles off a bunch of lore mysteries because the developers apparently felt these things needed to be revealed because this might be the last Dragon Age game. To be clear, I actually don't think these are necessarily bad answers to these lore mysteries. I just challenge the idea that these questions needed to be answered. Indeed, it might have been best to let the mysteries lie, because the possibilities we can conjure in our heads are often more tantalizing than the story starkly revealed to us in a voiceover. I also don't love that it's ancient elves all the way down behind the ancient mysteries. It makes the ancient world feel smaller and even less mysterious. I'm especially disappointed that there wasn't anything special about the old god dragons aside from being tied to the elven gods. I look at the Dragon Age setting post-Veilguard and I feel disenchanted. A lot of ambiguity and intrigue has been wiped away with very little to replace it. I'll talk about the secret ending another time, wait for that video. Technically, a lot of the world I love is still there, but this game's unwillingness to explore it makes it feel a bit lifeless. The Blight is apparently not gone after the ending, but neutered and seemingly reduced to being a pawn for whatever next apocalyptic threat shows up. The Qunari have also been defanged, with most of their darker tendencies seemingly shifted off to rogue elements, along with most of their militant religious expansionism. I struggle to whip up the old enthusiasm for this setting as it is. Everything's just a bit less intriguing and even bland. I want to leave you with a reminder that I don't actually hate this game. I had a lot of fun playing it. It's exciting, and if I meet it halfway, put aside what I want from a Dragon Age game, I'm able to get great enjoyment out of it. Despite some shortcomings, I think the companions are still fun enough for the most part, not bad additions to the BioWare lineup. And of course Act 3 is an incredible trip, sort of what I wanted Mass Effect 3 to be in expanding the suicide mission concept from Mass Effect 2. And I am a Solavellan at heart. I have a guilty pleasure for tortured romances in fiction, and Solus is the only time I've made romancing a male character part of my personal canon for an RPG for that reason. I was satisfied with the conclusion I was able to get there, and taken as a whole, I think this might be the most tightly designed and cohesive Dragon Age game in the series. Yet comparison is often the thief of joy. It's just, for however good this game may be, in many respects, it's missing much of the core of what I love about Dragon Age, and even what I love about RPGs. That leaves me with a rather hollow feeling when I think about this game. It's not a huge mystery why the game is this way. The Veilguard had a strange and extended development process with very different versions of the game. It was originally being developed as a very different game codenamed Joplin, but the version of the game that would become Veilguard entered development about 5 years before release, as a live service game with a prominent multiplayer component. I think the timing of this explains a lot about the game's tone, since it means the initial design direction decisions would have been made when the Marvel films were still riding the high of Avengers Endgame, and Electronic Arts hadn't changed its mind about single-player games yet. That wouldn't happen until the success of games like Jedi Survivor. The higher-ups at BioWare would apparently manage to convince the powers at EA to let them pivot to single-player around early 2021, but I expect they didn't get the sort of budget or resources they would need to massively change the direction. A lot of the design of the factions of this game, the tone, and how so many side quests are little more than going to a place and killing a thing, suggests a remnant of that older live service design to me. There are also data-mined design notes suggesting a lot more reactivity to past game choices was planned at some point, but I'm guessing it got cut due to the strained development. There are pieces of codex entries and missives that suggest to me the writers wanted to put a bit more political thought into the game than it seems. In one, Maevaris and Dorian debate political strategy and discuss how they should try to forge alliances with Soporati, or non-mage public officials and merchants to advance their cause. In another, Tea and Viago draft the wording of an assassination contract for the King of Antiva, such that it will give them free rein to assassinate anyone to blame for the occupation of Treviso. Then there are the missives detailing the effects of the conflict in the south, which feel tonally jarring and even contradictory to other parts of the game. A prominent example of that being the camping trip Harding and Emmerich take to the south, which these missives tell us is in the midst of an apocalyptic blight. The characters don't treat this as a concern or even acknowledge this. Codex entries and other text entries like this are usually written late in development and require few resources. I think the developers recognized the tonal problem with their game and tried to correct it somewhat by adding more stakes and at least some hints of political thought. It's too little too late for me, and I don't think those missives had the intended effect, because it left a lot of people thinking the goal was to effectively wipe out a lot of Southern Thetis so they don't have to reference those choices ever again. I don't think that was actually the intent, personally. As to the lighter tone generally, I'll just say that I don't need or want Dragon Age to have the same tone as The Witcher. Dragon Age has always had a bit of whimsy, but some middle ground between The Witcher and Veilguard's tone would be preferred for me. At the end of the day, Veilguard seems to be a single-player game salvaged from the remains of a very different game, and without a development cycle more focused on Dragon Age's strengths from the start, I don't think it ever could have been the game I wish it was. I haven't mentioned what the Dragon Age The Veilguard art book tells us other versions of the game might have been like, or drawn much from datamined cut content, because I don't think that's very fair. We can look at these concepts and build an ideal game from them in our heads, but even if these concepts had survived, that ideal implementation you're imagining may not have. I can say I like some of the concepts in the art book a lot more than what the game went with, in theory, but that is all. I still hope the game sells well. BioWare made a fun game, and I want to see the next Mass Effect. I believe in judging each game on its own merits, not carrying grudges for studios because I didn't like their latest game. I strongly dislike that side of online video game discourse. Each new game is a chance to turn things around, after all. If they get a chance to make another Dragon Age game, I will keep an eye on it and hope I see a true return to form. But I don't see myself spending what limited time I have to make videos returning to making Dragon Age lore explorations anytime soon. Veilguard just did not renew my enthusiasm for the setting. If anything, it did the opposite. I suspect my video about the secret ending and the executors will be my last until something new gets announced for the franchise. I think that will be all for today. If you got this far, I want you to leave a comment. Please tell me your feelings on the game, positive or negative. In the name of finding some common ground, if you hated Veilguard, I want you to leave a comment naming at least one thing you liked about it. And if you enjoyed Veilguard, I want to hear about something you didn't like. That's all for now. I hope you have a nice day.